Now, we have a new exhibition called Nova, and it collects items that have joined the Te Manawa collection in the last 5 years. Now, some of these items are quite old, some of them are relatively new, and you might raise your eyebrows a bit at seeing such a thing in a museum, but all of them have their own stories, and I've been interviewing some of the people who have donated these items to find out more about them. And it turns out that items as simple as an electric kettle or an electric fry pan actually have pretty interesting backgrounds, despite what you might think. So, to kick things off, here's Ernie Norris, who worked at Palmerston North-based company Ralta for a couple of years, and he tells the story of how he came to this country and the story behind some of the goods that they made.
Buildings there which were bombed by the Germans, and the outcome was that the company was moved into a complete, huge geographic area, so that if one part of it was bombed, the rest could still carry on. And they took over all sorts of like bus depots, large buildings, and assembly was spread around. And the headquarters was a huge big country house and sort of the grounds. And that, after the war, that was like the head office of Vickers Armstrong Supermarine. And I wanted to get into the drafting side, but I thought, well, I really know nothing about the practical side of it. So I did a 5-year apprenticeship as an aircraft woodworker, which was really more like a tool-making, pattern-making business, because we made the press tools by hand from a wood material called jabrock, which was very hard. And we were designing and building the prototype jet fighters. So I did my 5 years apprenticeship, and then I moved into the drawing office, and I stayed in the drawing office until the company decided they were going to move out of Hursley Park and go to a town called Bournemouth, where the company had a large airfield. And I didn't want to do that because I just got married and we bought a house. And one of my colleagues who came from the town of Portsmouth, which was sort of next along the coast from Southampton, said that there's a company on the outskirts of Portsmouth making aviation stuff with a drawing office, a contract office, and they were doing work on one of the 4-engine jet bombers. So we both went to that business, and I suppose I spent a bit less than a year there. The contract finished, and they closed the drawing office. They had a big area, a big workshop, doing all sorts of engineering assembly work on aircraft, but the drawing side was just shut down. So I then came back closer to Southampton to a company called Air Service Training at Hamble, and one of my ex-Supermarine colleagues was working there, and they were doing a rocket project. So I became a rocket scientist on Blue Steel, which was a rocket carried by a 4-jet bomber with a nuclear warhead. I worked on the rocket project until we finished it. Then one day the boss walked into an office of 300 of us, and sort of walked to the middle, stuck his arms out like this and said, "Everybody behind me, pack up and go home, and we'll send your wages on to you. We've lost out on the jet helicopter project. We'd put a tender in to do a jet helicopter, and we'd lost it. So that was the end of the development side of air service training. In 6 weeks, everybody had been made redundant. They'd sold all of the equipment, and we were all on the street. And in those days, we worked on drawing boards with a T-square, and the only computer device was on a dais in the middle of the floor, and it did 4 functions: basic, a division, multiplication, subtraction at the end. So anyway, I brought up one of the drawing boards and T-squares, which I've actually got with me now in Fielding still. And I looked around for a job and thought, well, what the hell, there's no future in aviation. And I'd heard of the Dimplex company, so I rang them up and talked to the development manager. He said, look, I'm looking for a chief draftsman. You better come and see me. So I went, met with him and got the job of chief draftsman and spent 10 years with them designing a whole range of electric heating appliances. And the thing that the company had kicked off was the oil-filled electric radiator, which was quite big business. And we also made a water version of it, a hot water version, because in the UK, even to this day, central heating, domestic central heating with hot water radiators is still probably the biggest form of heating. All sorts of different boilers have been produced, so you have somewhere out the back a boiler tucked away which heats the hot water, pumps the water around. So anyway, we developed, we got involved in the early stages of infrared heating. Those heaters that were up on the wall and had a beam. So designed a range of those and quite interesting, all sorts of things. And then that brought me to Dreamland to design the blanket.
And then on to New Zealand.
And then on to New Zealand, yes.
Wow. Designing jet bombers to electric blankets, that seems like it's a bit of a jump.
Bit of a difference, but interesting. Interesting. And the process is essentially much the same. If you're going to design something, you've got to work it out and draw it. But I mean, I think one of the skills it did give me was to draw everything complete. Now, in the building industry in New Zealand, we have all sorts of people complaining about their new house, something wrong with it. And I think the major problem seems to be that the architectural people do not do a full drawing design, which we had. I mean, every last nut and bolt on an aeroplane or a rocket or whatever had to be carefully designed and drawn and specified, and there was no possible chance of anything going wrong. I mean, within the industry itself, you had to be ultra careful. All of our tradespeople had a board with their tools mounted on the board and painted black and white, so that if a tool was missing off the tool board, you had to find it before you could do anything and leave, because a single spanner or screwdriver left in an aeroplane can cause it to crash. And we had just that in Fielding 3 or 4 years ago, when 2 local doctors, I think, one owned an aeroplane and they were doing some aerobatics, and that aircraft had peculiar covers to do filling up fuel and what have you, and there was a screwdriver positioned inside the cockpit to take it out, undo the cover, put the fuel in, fill it up, tighten it, put it back. And the screwdriver came loose, it jammed the controls, and they crashed in one of the parks and killed both of them. So, the whole industry was equipped with everything had to be right and be safe and be fully designed, fully engineered in every respect. You couldn't afford a single mistake, otherwise the aircraft might crash. So I found that a very, very useful discipline, which wherever I worked, I tried to make the people do the same.
Transfers well over to designing
indeed.
Electric fry pans.
Yes. I was working in the UK with Dreamland Appliances, making electric blankets. And the boss of the company gave a license to a firm in New Zealand, and they had hired a chap to be their works manager in the UK who came and spent some time with us, and I had the job of showing him how to make electric blankets. And it was really quite difficult, and I said to the boss, look, really, we need someone to go down there and sort of show them what to do. So he said, well, look, would you do it? So I had a 2-year contract with Ralta in Palmerston North to set up the factory, train the staff and get everything done. So I did that, and I spent about 3 years with Ralta, and I found, I couldn't sort of get any further with Alan Lockie, the owner. He didn't want to develop the business and get into a range of appliances other than what we were doing. And I was having problems hiring staff for the tool room or the drawing office. I had to bring them in from the UK. So I thought, well, I think I'd better go and train a few. So I talked to the principal of what was in those days Palmerston North Technical Institute, and he said, oh, great, look, I need somebody who could be our liaison person, the liaison officer, to visit high schools and talk to them about tertiary education, because in those days we only had a polytech in Wellington, Palmerston North, Hamilton and Auckland. So I covered an area from New Plymouth to Napier, sort of down to Otaki and across to the East Coast. And I used to visit every high school there and talk to them about tertiary education. But I spent the other half of my time, because I had a drafting background, I took charge of the drafting side of the Polytech, and all the students from engineering, from woodworking and so forth, used to come into my classes and so forth. Now, 1978, the government set up the Small Business Agency as a division of the Development Finance Corporation of New Zealand. And the people in the Palmerston North office knew me and said, look, we want to set up a national training program in business management. Would you write it for us? So I talked to my boss at the Polytech, and he said, oh yes, you do that and we'll run it as evening classes. So with sort of various colleagues from other Polytechs, we put together a 6-part education program, of which I was the editor of the whole thing, and I wrote some of the material. And that started off with the Small Business Agency, sort of starting to put it into place. And then in 1980, they said to me, well, look, would you come and join us as our education coordinator and run this program? And, I sort of used to come in and see the people, because they were running these programs, and I went to every Polytech in New Zealand to help them set up and run it. But most of them hadn't run a program like that before. In fact, I think we may have been the first in running a program. I concentrate on 2 things: business management and business accounting. I stayed with the Small Business Agency until 1986, when David Long's Labour government said there was no need for the government to help small business. They were making plenty of money and could do their own thing. And with 3 months' pay and a kick up the ass, we were all on the street. So I thought, right, I'll become self-employed as a business advisor, business educator. And from there on, I worked with a whole range of different government departments and organizations. And for example, I think I spent almost 27 years as a part-time lecturer with Massey in industrial processes and so on, production technology. I worked with a whole variety of different people and places, and adult continuing education. I ran night school programs for years and years, concentrating on business management and business accounting.
Your first work with Ralta was making electric blankets?
Oh yeah, well you see, Ralta had been making blankets with the old-fashioned method was called tunnel cloth, where two pieces of fabric were machined together in a machine process. As the fabric was woven, it was also machined. So two pieces with gaps between the rows of sewing, and you cut a blanket shape and put it onto a table. You had a woman on each side, and they had a long steel rod, and the element wire was attached to the end of the rod, and the rod was poked through the first channel, all the wire was pulled through, then it was poked back the next one, and it took ages to make a single blanket. And you had one length of cable, heating element wire, which sort of went in one side and came out the other. Then you joined them together with a lead, and that was your blanket. Very expensive, very slow process. Now, a guy in Dreamland Appliances in the UK invented a process of welding fabric together. The fabric was specially made. It had a plastic film on one side, and you put the two plastic sort of foamed surfaces together, and with a high-frequency welding machine, you could make a permanent bond of the cloth. And the setup was that we had a large table with a welding machine at the end of a conveyor belt. You first of all spiked the one side of the cloth on, and then the element was already made up in length, and that was put around pins. Then the second layer of cloth was put on top. It went into the welding machine, and you ended up with a blanket completely welded together. All you had to do then was trim the edges and sew them, join the supply cable. So I had to set up the whole setup in Ralta. We got a single welding machine made because they thought that would be sufficient to meet their demand. And the welding machine was built in Auckland by a specialist company, and we set up, and I had to train the staff how to work and design the products for them. And I spent, as I say, about 3 years with them, and then moved on.
Now, did Ralta at that time also do the jugs and the pans that you
were
with before?
Yeah, well, I mean, Ralta did a range. So they started off with blankets and electric fry pans. And the electric fry pan was originally subcontracted to Wellington, because the company there used to cast the base, and the element was included in the base. When we decided we would get into a range of pots and pans, we bought 2 special metal spinning machines from Germany, which were completely automatic, and we were then able to make a whole range of non-electric pots and fry pans and so forth. So we made, blankets, a heating pad, a small blanket which you could sort of put around you if you had a sore back or a sore shoulder or something, and heat would help it. The heating pad could be just sort of, hung on and tied on or something, and give you some heat in that direction. A lot of the stuff was subcontracted and just sold by Ralta with their name on. For example, we had a little battery clock which folded up into a case so that you could take it as an alarm clock. And you could unfold the thing and set it up by your bedside and set the alarm, and the thing would ring and so forth. We made a small plastic fan, because again, Ralta had got a number of plastic moulding machines, and the early 70s was the sort of beginning of the age when we moved from things made of metal to things made of plastic. Plastic jugs, for example. So we had the fan, just a desk fan to blow cold air over you. Somebody had the bright idea we'd make stereos. We had a joiner who came to set the whole thing up and run it, and when it was closed down, he joined the Polytech as one of the staff there. And the sort of the stereo thing, I think it only lasted about a year or so, and then it just quietly folded up because there was no market for them. You know, a classic example of, rather than seeing what the market wanted and what the competition were offering, we just plunged into it because Lockie thought that was the thing, and it was a bit of a disaster.
So what would the design process of one of these pans be like? Because you designed some of them?
Well, Lockie or one of the directors would see something, an appliance somewhere, and say, oh, I think we ought to make this, you see. Now, we had a chap who was sort of the works director named Bill Burnby, and he was sent off to Germany to go and visit a trade fair. And the Germans have 2 or 3 big, really huge, big trade fairs each year, and he came back with a bread toaster, a 2-slice bread toaster. You know, a well-known German company made it. And they brought it into the office one day and said, oh, look, we're going to make this toaster. What was different about it was you dropped the bread in the top, and when it was cooked, there were hinged arms that carried the bread, and they came up like this, so that the bread poked out of, or lifted into like a corner, and you could see it and take it out. So they brought this sample in, and with my office staff, we took it completely to pieces, examined every part of it, and looked at the process. And the Germans had obviously used a fairly sophisticated process of press work, and which we didn't have. And we were told that this is what the Krauts are selling, so therefore we've got to copy it exactly, and you can't change anything. And I pleaded to sort of, let's have a few basic changes. No, that's got to be. So I took it to the tool room and talked to the people there, and they said, well, they're all individual parts. We'll have to make individual tools for everything, and it's going to be a lot of work and rhubarb, you know. So we made it, and all these different pieces came out, and most of them had sharp edges. And we had teams of 8 or 9 ladies assembling these, and without a word of a lie, they had all 10 fingers and thumbs bound up with bandages where they'd cut themselves, and it was absolutely hopeless. And we carried on for a bit making it, and then stopped, because what we discovered was that it was a prototype that Bill had been given at this trade fair. They'd never made it, the Germans had never made it at all as a production model. They changed to something else, and we ended up making a conventional pop-up toaster, which was very simple and straightforward. But this German was a classic of every mistake that could be made was deliberately made because the management said, you can't change anything because this is what the Germans have made.
So all of that effort, all for nothing in the end.
Yeah. So anyway, that sort of was just one example, and a number of things we designed. Usually, if something was brought in and they wanted a copy of it, we would design it to suit our setup and our type of equipment, so that we could mould it with our machines and so forth.
Right. How many of them would you make a year?
I can't remember what Ralta production was like. It would be many thousands. I mean, I see the blanket setup, for example, with only one welding press, there was a limit to how many blankets could be made. But they carried on for a long time. I mean, after I'd left, Sunbeam bought the company, was sold to Sunbeam, and Lockie sort of got out of that sort of thing, sort of retired, really. And then Sunbeam got the Chinese to come and make the blankets, so the production went to China, just as in the UK, Dreamland subcontracted the blankets to China for manufacturing. So all they did was to retain a marketing arm, selling the stuff as a Dreamland blanket, but it was no longer made in the UK or in New Zealand for that matter. And that was just the way of life, really, because the Chinese offered such better prices. And with a smaller, literally all you needed was a stores setup and a sales setup, and you were in business.
I think a lot of people might find it odd that something from the 80s is in a museum, but you don't see them anymore, do they? We've changed
a great deal, and they're worth keeping. They're worth putting in a museum.